People who have had a near-death experience and what they described can be vastly different from each other, and there appears to be no set rules on what to expect when you actually have one. The following story is a case in point where an Australian man had an NDE that was very unusual, but he swears it was not a dream, but a genuine NDE. In 1981, Bill John from New South Wales, Australia, had an out-of-body experience after a serious heart attack, which he was fortunate enough to recover from, but what he experienced stayed fresh in his memory for many years, where he remembered every little detail. At the time of the incident, Bill was about 60 years old and had been suffering chest pains, which he initially ignored. But when the pain persisted, he called the ambulance, and within half an hour, he found himself in an emergency ward on a medical table and given an electrocardiogram. At this stage, he had been given no drugs or any form of painkiller at all, so his mind remained clear and lucid. As he was laying on the table, all of a sudden, the acoustic tiles in the ceiling started to waver as if they were floating on water. It was at this stage that Bill believed the end was close, but said he was not really afraid, but strangely curious, as he felt he was about to transition from his existing life to another. He then found himself in a plain pastel-coloured square room, about 3.5 meters high, with sides about 8 meters long. He sensed there was another wall about 1 meter behind him, and could not tell whether the wall ahead of him was solid or a space that stretched into infinity that consisted of what looked to be vertical drapes. Each drape was about 1 meter wide and was stretched tightly from floor to ceiling and vibrated as if an electric fan was blowing on it. Each drape was about 1 meter apart, and behind them was another series of drapes. All of the drapes were light pink at the top, but the colour slowly became a darker pink as they reached the bottom. The lighting was fairly even and not too intensive, but he could not see where the source of the light was coming from. But it was what came next that took Bill by surprise when he saw people, but only their heads and shoulders. The people were in 2s and 3s and were all peering at him from behind the drapes. These were not just people visiting the ward in the strange hospital environment, they were all familiar faces, and to his utter amazement, he saw his deceased mother in the centre of one of the groups of people, along with many friends and childhood acquaintances. All of the people he had known and loved during the childhood, but what was the most striking was the expression on their faces that showed extreme happiness, interest, excitement, joy, and expectation. He could see that they were totally overjoyed at his arrival. Words could not express the magnitude of their feelings at his arrival, and Bill felt fulfilled. At this stage, all Bill wanted to do was go to his mother, but he was unable to do so as something was stopping him. Suddenly, 3 figures who appeared to be men of average height, wearing what looked to be business suits, materialized from what appeared to be a mass of shimmering snowflakes. The men then rapidly increased in size and density and then became solid, and they stood in line, close together at right angles to him and on his left-hand side. Then all of a sudden, 6 isolated events in his life came to him, but they appeared as mental images in full colour and 3-dimensional, as he had experienced in real life. Each image finished with the decision that he had made, the action he had taken, and the effect that each had had on the later lives of the people concerned. Bill was impressed at what he was seeing, but at the same time frightened. He even said that he felt a bit smug at how his intentions had worked out for the people. More changes took place where the 3 men on his left then disappeared from whence they came. Then he was surrounded by a shimmering light, and he could see his legs. He again tried to walk to his mother, but again something was stopping him. At this stage, he was not thinking about himself and was unaware of how he was dressed, but he was thinking, well, here I am, but what about his wife Gwyneth? She's still alive. He had no sooner thought about his wife when his thoughts were brought to a sudden and painful stop that felt like a blow to the back of his head. It felt as if someone had hit him with a baseball bat. After the serene and pleasant experience he'd just been through, he was now angry and upset and hoped that he might be able to return to the world he had just left. He then tried a 3rd time to reach his mother, but then another blow, as painful as the first, struck him, where he shouted, "Don't!" When the ceiling in the emergency room appeared over his head, he knew he was back. He said the disappointment he then felt was indescribable, and he now felt shattered and resentful. He had not wanted to come back. He looked up and saw the medical team staring down at him. They asked him whether he remembered what he had shouted out, and if so, what did he say? Bill then repeated the words, "No" and "don't." He assumed that what he had said was normal, and there had probably been many other people angry about being brought back from somewhere as beautiful as where he had just been. Bill was discharged from the hospital 10 days later, and now had a different attitude on life. He realised that it was not yet his time, but after he was told that he needed a triple bypass, he decided to ignore their advice. He no longer had a fear of dying, but was disappointed when his family and friends refused to listen to his amazing story, and they said they didn't want to hear about it. He could not understand why anyone would not want to know the details of an experience such as his, with the promise of an afterlife. On the evening of June the 19th, 1978, John and Gloria Mann and daughters Natasha 5 and Tanya 3 and John's sister Frances were travelling home to Gloucester in southwest England. Shortly after passing a village called Stamford in the Vale, they noticed a bright light in the sky that appeared to be following their car. John decided to stop the car near a hedge, but as he got out of the car, the light had vanished. But suddenly, a huge bowl-shaped craft appeared directly in front of the car, before slowly moving to the right and sinking down below the trees, but not before seeing a line of coloured lights along the rim of the object. His wife and sister also observed the same lights. They then heard a strange swishing sound and watched the craft move up and down a few times as if it had difficulty in landing. Fearful, John jumped back into the car and quickly drove off. But things got even stranger when the road, which they had driven on many times, looked unfamiliar. It appeared narrower and was flanked by tall hedges at certain points where there should have been broad views of the countryside. All of the adults were feeling uneasy, and there was no possibility that they'd driven down the wrong road, as there was no turn-off on that stretch of road. Their journey on the hedged-in roads seemed endless, and certain parts seemed to repeat themselves, and the road that should have been straight and flat was now curved and undulated. They had the sensation that they were floating and were in a dreamlike state, and if he let go of the steering wheel and took his foot off the accelerator, the car would move by itself. As this was taking place, the light in the sky continued to follow them. Eventually, they reached the town of Farringdon, and the light in the sky vanished. But the moment they continued their journey on the open road, the light reappeared. But after passing through the town of Cirencester, the light vanished. They arrived home an hour later than they should have. John called the RAF to ask whether there were any experimental aircraft flying around, and after extensive checks, they found nothing. After Frances went home, John and Gloria went straight to bed feeling unwell, but they were awoken an hour later by the same swishing sound that the UFO had made. Over the following days, both John and Gloria suffered from unexplained itching, and all three adults found strange marks on their bodies, like sharply defined bruises, but they were not painful. 1 week after the incident, John was in bed with the flu and had weird dreams where he was entering a flying saucer. In the dreams, he and the others had stepped out of the car onto a sloping beam that led to a doorway onto the side of a craft. They were walking along a corridor with curved walls. John then entered a room off of the corridor, and the women and children entered another room. The room had electronic instruments that covered the walls, and in the middle of the room was what looked to be a black dentist chair. He was told telepathically to sit on the chair, where they restrained his legs. Then a thin beam of light came out of the panel and scanned his body. After that, he was released from the chair and returned to the corridor and went up with the others, where they walked out of the craft and back to the car. A few days later, his sister had a similar dream where she had observed aliens watching them as they entered the craft, and they were wearing tight-fitting silver outfits. Their daughter, Natasha, also had dreams where she's been examined by silver-clad aliens with funny eyes, but also had waking recollections of what had happened. She said as they were leaving the craft, they were given a fizzy drink, which they said would help them forget their experience, but she would not drink it. Natasha said that a lady in a gold suit fetched them from the car and had also turned off the car's engine and the lights. She said the UFO had retractable legs, which went up into the spaceship in a lift. Inside the craft, she saw a huge screen that showed the road and their car below them. She described a room full of aliens of both sexes. They all sat down and were gripped in the middle by a safety belt and had the sensation of the spaceship taking off. She said that a woman called Achilles had taken her into a room and showed her a video of the flying saucer they were in. The film showed the saucer landing on several other planets where there were monsters, huge naked hairy men who were covered in mud and lived with their families in caves and sleeping on straw mattresses. She's seen 4 types of monsters, and the names were Saunuses, Vanissons, Gaines, and Fusanthiuses. When she drew them, they all looked humanoid. The first 3 were unfriendly, but the last, the Fusanthiuses, looked like the classic little green men. UFO investigator Frank Johnson suggested they undergo regressive hypnosis. Whilst under, Francis, John and Natasha were all consistent in their recollections of their abduction and what really happened. After their car stopped, it was surrounded by mist. As the spaceship appeared, several figures in silver suits surrounded the car. As they got out of the car, a beam of light shone down from the spaceship above. As they stood in the light, the beam floated them up to the ship. Natasha looked down and saw one of the aliens turn off the car's engine and lights. They floated into the craft through a hatch and found themselves in a large circular room about 150 feet in diameter. An alien led them to a moving ramp that led up to a balcony where there were 4 silver-suited men. They were then welcomed and told they would all be examined to see whether Earthlings were the same as them, and afterwards they would answer any questions. After a tour of the ship, they would be escorted back to their car, and everything would seem as if it had never stopped driving. After the introduction, the adults were taken into a separate room while the children remained with their mother. Like John, Frances found herself in a room with what looked like a dentist's chair. She was told telepathically to sit down and would not be harmed. She was then thrust back into the chair before being dazzled by a bright light. She started to panic before a soothing image helped her relax. She noticed 2 thin silver-suited men who attended to instruments around the wall. They were about 6 feet tall, with blue eyes and short blonde hair. After being in the chair for about 20 minutes, she was told that there was not much difference between them except that the human pulse rate was higher, but that was probably due to being abducted. The aliens said that if they had lived on our planet, their pulse rate would possibly adjust over time. When Frances left the examination room, she met a bald alien around 2 inches taller than the others. The alien took her to what looked like a cafe where there were about 20 aliens sitting around drinking. An alien by the name of Uxwalia introduced himself to her and said he was a pilot from Janos that was about 7,000 light years away, but the journey only took them about 2 Earth years. He then showed her a film about people dying from radiation sickness on his planet Janos and how the planet was destroyed. He showed her stills and films of children playing and women wearing colourful clothing. People were boating on a lake and picnicking together. Frances was intrigued by the strange-looking fruit and vegetables and that they ate very little meat. He said that advanced technology where cars floated above ground. Their ships were powered by static electricity, and coming to Earth was like going back in time. He then returned her to the family. She noticed that the furniture was bolted down and watched as the aliens tapped out instruments on buttons. John had been accompanied by an alien called Anoxia, who was some kind of leader, but was not actually in charge as the ship was run by a computer. Anoxia was about 6 feet tall with blue eyes and short blonde hair. Then 2 silver-clad female aliens entered who were about 5'3". Their skin was soft and young-looking. They wore flimsy silver helmets, and most of the aliens wore round badges on their chests. Their names were Sicilius and Consentia. They said their purpose for the visit was whether they could adapt to life on Earth and had planned to settle here permanently. He heard them speaking to each other in an incomprehensible language. He was then taken on a tour of the ship, where he was escorted to a deck. He saw a huge rotor and was told that if it spun fast enough, it acted as an anti-gravity machine where it generated enough electricity at an extremely high voltage. John believed their ship operated on nothing more than a huge Van de Graaff generator. John was given a tour of the engine full of wires and monitors. He was shown the navigation room that contained a horse-shaped disc that controlled the ship. John asked the Nuxia where they came from, and it showed John their journey in reverse. Starting from Earth, they shot out through the solar system until they reached their planet called Janos that had 2 moons. He told John about the destruction of that planet and how it had once been green and fertile. Their people were now in underground chambers, looking disfigured and some dying. He was taken back to his family, where Nuxia said that they would meet again. They were then offered a drink to help them forget their experience, because if they remembered everything, it would put the aliens in danger. They were told they would remember nothing and would return to their car. In February 1958, the house belonging to a family named Herman was besieged by strange and inexplicable incidents that were attributed to a poltergeist who was dubbed Popper. The family lived at 1648 Redwood Path, Seaford, New York. The rented old house was built in 1953 and had 3 bedrooms, bathroom, kitchen and small dining room, living room and basement. They lived in a quiet, conservative neighbourhood. Around 3:30 p.m. on the afternoon of February the 3rd, 1958, Lucille Herman, a registered nurse, was welcoming her children home from school. They were Lucille, 13, and James, 12, but their ordinary world was about to change. Shortly after the children walked into the kitchen, chaos erupted in the house, and in a matter of moments, various bottles containing liquid in different rooms of the house began to pop their caps and dance around. Although nobody actually witnessed this happening, they could clearly hear the caps as they popped loose and the contents squirted into the air. The lady discovered an open bottle of bleach in the basement, a bottle of liquid starch in the kitchen, and bottles of shampoo and medicine in the bathroom, and a bottle of holy water that had opened in the master bedroom and was lying on its side with the contents spilled. What made it all the more mysterious was that none of the bottles had corks that may have come loose, but were sealed with twist-off metal or plastic caps. Confused, Mrs. Herman called her husband, who worked for Air France in New York City, and told him about the strange popping sounds in the house. He was also confused and could offer no explanation, but the fact that no one had been hurt decided there was no need to go home early. He arrived home around 7 p.m, believing that some sort of chemical reaction in the products had caused the bottle lids to blow, and it was just a coincidence that they did it all at the same time, figuring it was caused by excessive humidity in the house. However, he was even more baffled when he found that all the bottles had screw-top lids. How could they all simply have popped off? After that, everything calmed down, and the family put it down to just one of those things. After 2 days, the incident was almost forgotten. But then, on the Thursday, just like before, as the children came home from school, a bottle of nail polish burst open, along with a bottle of rubbing alcohol, a bottle of bleach, detergent, starch, and again, the bottle that contained holy water on Mrs. Herman's dresser. It was almost identical to February the 3rd. Then on Friday night, it happened again. But this time, when the bottles popped open, James Herman began to suspect that his science-loving son had planted some carbonated capsules inside the bottles and timed it when he arrived home from school to scare the family. So James Herman spent the weekend secretly observing his son in the hope of catching him in the act. But on Sunday morning, February the 9th, several caps popped off bottles of starch, turpentine and holy water. But he'd been watching his son's movements. So how could he have managed to put something into the bottles without his father seeing him do it? So he burst into the bathroom where his son was brushing his teeth and accused him of sabotaging the bottles. But as his son was protesting his innocence, a bottle of medicine suddenly moved across the top of the sink and fell into the basin, and then a bottle of shampoo also slid across the sink and fell onto the floor. Not convinced, he examined the bathroom looking for hidden wires, but found nothing. Finally, he had to accept the fact that there was something going on in the house that could not be explained. He called the Nassau County Police Department and spoke to Lieutenant E. Richardson about the incidents, but he accused Herman of either playing a joke or drinking too much. The fact that James Herman sounded credible, as well as having a good reputation in the community, promised to send someone to investigate. Officer James Hughes was sent to the house, feeling extremely sceptical, but shortly after arriving, his mind about the unusual case immediately changed when several bottles in the bathroom popped their lids and fired them in his direction, and came to the conclusion that the family needed help. Detective Joseph Totsi read Officer Hughes' report of the incident, believing that the family could be experiencing a natural phenomenon, but at the same time wanted to leave room for doubt. Detective Totsi visited the Herman house on February the 11th, and that evening a perfume atomizer overturned and spilled perfume in their daughter's bedroom, and according to all reports, there was no one in the room at the time. On February the 15th, there was an incident in the parents' bedroom where the lid on the bottle of holy water popped off. After hearing the popping sound, Mr. Herman ran into the room and found the bottle on the floor. As he picked it up, he found the bottle felt warm. That same day, as the Herman children were watching television with their cousin Maria Murta, a porcelain figurine at the end of the table next to the couch started to wiggle before shooting into the air, making a loud crashing sounds as it hit the floor. Yet the figurine did not break. After the last incident, the family decided to contact a Father William MacLeod of the Church of St. William the Abbot for help. The Hermans were devout Catholics and believed that the church could help them where every other method had failed. So Father MacLeod came to the house and sprinkled holy water in each of the rooms, but unfortunately the poltergeist did not want to leave. Eventually the activity in the house reached the public, where the house was surrounded by reporters, photographers, curious onlookers and TV screens. They started to receive letters and telephone calls, with others suggesting it was the Martians, a long-dead Indian chief, or even the Russians. Some even shouted "repent" over the telephone. Others condemned the Hermans for their sins and invited Satan. Certain ministers of faith conducted rituals on the front lawn, and one man in a blue suit knelt on the lawn and prayed for 10 minutes before standing up and announcing, "Everything is all right, you've been forgiven," before leaving. Of course, that failed. Robert Zeder, a physicist from Brookhaven National Laboratory, bought a set of dowsing rods and went over the property with them. He believed there were underground streams below the house and the water might be creating a freak magnetic field, but a geological survey suggested that the information was inaccurate. On another occasion, Detective Totsi was walking down the basement stairs with Herman's son when a large bronze statue of a horse flew across the basement and hit the detective in the legs. Nobody was near the statue, and Detective Totsi was totally baffled. They contacted the Air Force regarding their flight plans, wondering whether sonic booms from passing jets could have caused the disturbances. Radio waves are also ruled out by the Radio Corporation of America. The Long Island Lighting Company set up an oscilloscope in the basement, but detected no underground vibrations. Building inspectors found the house structurally sound. The Seaford Fire Department inspected a well on the property to see if changes in the water level could be causing the disturbances, but found it had been stable for the last 5 years. On February the 20th, events became even more violent when another figurine was smashed against the desk. A bottle of ink popped its screw cap before flying through the air and splashing its contents on the wall. Then a sugar bowl flew off the table in front of Detective Totsi. On February the 24th, Detective Totsi was startled by a sound coming from their son's room. They found that a large bookcase had fallen face down onto the floor. The following night, as their son was in the room doing his homework, his record player lifted and moved 15 feet across the room, and a small statue of the Virgin Mary flew into the air before striking a mirror in the master bedroom. A bookcase filled with encyclopedias was pushed over. A heavy glass centerpiece from the dining room table flew up and struck a cupboard, chipping away a piece of moulding before falling to the floor. A world globe flew down the hallway, just missing the detective. Newspaper photographer John Gold from the London Evening News witnessed his flash bowls lift off a table and fly through the air before striking a wall. Up to that point, the activity had been limited to popping bottle tops. Scientists at the Parapsychology Laboratory at Duke University, North Carolina, became interested in the events in the Herman home. So a group of researchers led by Dr. Ryan compiled evidence in support of the idea that certain people, under the right circumstances, could influence the behavior of objects without touching them. They called it psychokinesis. As the disturbances at the home increased, on February the 26th, Dr. Ryan's assistant, Dr. Pratt, travelled to the Herman's house believing that someone in the house was unknowingly causing the paranormal activity and that an adolescent child was almost responsible for the poltergeist phenomena, and believed it was possible that the young person might be capable of psychokinesis during the height of puberty. In every case, they are unaware that she or he was unconsciously causing the events to happen. Dr. Pratt explained that he'd come as an observer and spent most of the time talking with their son Jimmy. There was no activity during the visit and everything was quiet. Pratt then invited William G. Roll to the house, and after interviewing the family, were convinced that none of them were perpetrating a hoax. For the next few days, everything was quiet. But then on March the 2nd, and 1 month after the poltergeist first arrived, it decided to make itself known again. The family were in the house to witness everything. First, a dish flew from the kitchen cabinet, breaking on the floor. Then a table flipped over in Jimmy's room. It was back, but there was still no explanation as to what it was. 2 days later, a bowl of flowers slid down the dining room table and jumped into the air. A bookcase turned end over end in the cellar. On March the 10th, as Mrs. Herman and the children were getting ready for bed, Pratt and Roll suddenly heard a loud popping sound in the cellar, and as they raced downstairs, found that a bleach bottle sitting in a cardboard box had somehow lost its plastic lid. Strangely, this was the last act of the poltergeist, and after a record of 67 recorded disturbances between February the 3rd and March the 10th, where the family had been visited by detectives, building inspectors, electricians, and plumbers, firemen, and parapsychologists, none of them were able to present a rational explanation for the paranormal activity. As late as August 1958, the scientists at St. Jude still had no clue to what had happened and why. A Weird World viewer called Mark has sent us his account of his paranormal experience. I have a story that started in 1958 and led to the most frightening evening of my life in 1972. I have never been so frightened ever since. I was born in Inglewood, California in August 1958, and my parents had both been touched by the supernatural in their early years. We lived in Los Angeles in a rented home owned by my grandmother. I have two much older brothers being 10 and 11 years older than I. The house, located on Exposition Place, was far too small for all of us. My father used his GI Bill to purchase a brand new home in a place my mother called The Sticks, Whittier, California. We would drive there on the weekends to watch the construction of the new house. The property was once an orange grove, and the main house was supposed to be demolished to make room for this new subdivision. My mother was the first to notice and complain that our lot is misshapen because the old house is still standing. The realty company was unable to get the owner to sell, so with much regret, our lot was given a triangle shape. The old house was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Schutz, an older couple without children. An easement was placed alongside our house for the Schutz to go in and out of their home. We moved in 1959, and Mrs. Schutz died unexpectedly in 1960. Then in 1961, Mr. Schutz remarried. The first night of their honeymoon in the old house, the new wife ran out and refused to go back inside ever again. This forced Mr. Schutz to find a new house to live in, and, while I looked for a new residence to move in, they lived in a motel. We were hired by Mr. Schutz to watch the house. In 1962, Mr. and Mrs. Schutz had found a new house to move into, far away from Whittier. The old house at this time became unsettled, with curtains moving by themselves during the day, causing us to walk around the house and then unlock it to go inside and investigate why and how are these curtains moving in all the different rooms. But they only moved when nobody was in the house, and by then it was then completely empty. One evening my dad was home from work and was working on the engine of his old car, illuminated with a work light and flashlight, parked between the old house and ours underneath the Schutz large avocado tree. I like to think of my dad being a World War II veteran, as brave and not afraid of anything. But this evening he ran into the house from the back porch door with all the hair on his head standing upright. I thought he was so funny that I laughed. He gathered all of us in the living room and ordered all of us, including my mum, to never go outside at night to our backyard ever again, and just forget about ever going out there to pick avocados in the evening. It took some coaxing to get all of the details of what had taken place outside in the evening darkness. The phenomenon first started with what sounded like a woman crying and sobbing inside the Schutz's house. So my dad walked up to the empty house, and the sobbing was loudest at the window of the master bedroom. Someone was inside. The curtains opened, revealing an empty room, with all the windows of the old house closed and locked from the inside. The crying and sobbing continued. I moved inside the old house, quickly coming outside and down the porch steps and moving rapidly towards my dad, until the sound was right up to his ears. The crying was so loud and the sobbing so intense that my dad dropped everything and ran for his life into our house and locked the door. I was so young that I wasn't afraid, and I didn't hear the crying. Our neighbours didn't really believe what was going on in the old house, so we would watch and listen for disturbances during the day. This watching the old house became something for us small kids on the block to do. For the next 2 years, we younger kids would tell stories to each other of the old house. My best friend, his little sister and I would observe the old house while playing in our backyard, and we would see the curtains move on occasions, which would make us scared and scream. But nothing was truly frightening. We became less scared each time something was seen moving inside the old house. My brothers were teenagers in 1965 and were having their friends over more often. They would gather in my older brother's bedroom and hang out in the kitchen. The kitchen window faces the old house, and while some of my brother's friends were playing records in my older brother's bedroom, one of them, Larry, went to the kitchen and saw a face right up against the glass looking at him. A face with the shape of a diamond and fire coming from the eyes. He ran past me in the living room and with a pure look of terror on his face and his blonde hair standing up and waving as he ran out the front door and into the cul-de-sac of our street. He couldn't stop repeating that he'd seen the devil himself with fire pouring from his eyes. Larry was unglued by his experience and he was given the nickname of Crazy Larry. But no one I know today, Larry wasn't crazy and deserves an apology from his friends that gave him such a title. The old house sold and then was occupied again in 1966 by another childless couple, the Padillas. A new chain-link fence separated the property and cut us off from the avocados we'd grown accustomed to. As a kid, I asked Mrs. Padilla if she'd seen or heard anything unusual in or around the house. Mrs. Padilla said no, nothing strange at all. In 1972, the Padillas moved, leaving the house empty again. In June 1972, I was out of school for summer vacation. My brothers had both moved out and were living in an apartment. One day I was home alone and my mum and dad were out. We had 2 dogs in our backyard. It was 10:50 in the evening and I was in the living room with the TV on. I heard the dogs making a noise like they were fighting with each other. Nothing like this had ever happened before and I was startled. I went to the sliding patio door and saw the 2 dogs jumping and leaping at something invisible. It must be huge because these dogs are German shepherds and they were acting very seriously against an unseen enemy and they were getting closer and closer. I turned on the patio light and still I saw nothing that these dogs were attacking. I closed and locked the sliding door just in the nick of time as my 2 dogs slammed into the door. Whatever they were going up against was now in the room with me. It felt like all the air in the room had been sucked out, and I was in a vacuum. I could still breathe, but the sound from outside and the TV were muffled and dull, barely audible. Now I was scared, and I ran for my life to my bedroom. I closed the door, but whatever was in the living room was now tossing and breaking all the furniture in the living room. I could feel the wooden floor beneath me bouncing up and down with each crash. Now I was really scared because I didn't know what to do if it got to me in my room. I could hear it splintering the floor and breaking through the wall into my eldest brother's bedroom. It was tearing his old room apart, and the huge console radio too. It punched through the guest bathroom wall and into the attached garage. Everything in there was being destroyed, and I could hear it make an inhuman guttural groaning as it punched out the garage and into the easement. I was at the bedroom window looking out to sea as I heard my mum and dad pull into the driveway. I was too scared to leave the bedroom, so I screamed through the open window, "Do you see it?" But they hadn't got out of the car yet. So as I got out, I continued to scream in fright, "Help me get out of this room! Do you see it?" They came inside and opened my door, and they brought me out as my dad did a look in every room. My dad went outside, it was only a couple of minutes past 11 p.m, and saw another neighbour called Mr. Peterson with a flashlight looking at his house on the other side of the easement. But I'd asked if he ever saw or heard anything, and Mr. Peterson replied that he thought he heard his wooden fence falling over, but everything appeared fine. My mum and dad looked all over the house and garage and found nothing out of place or broken. It was just a noise, a very large and booming noise. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd have stayed in the living room with the noise of crashing and booming and splintering of wood and plaster snapping. Should I have been braver? And what would I have learned by staying? Today, I would welcome another chance to experience the supernatural firsthand. Or did I make the best decision and run from it? Possibly the most well-known poltergeist haunting took place between 1977 and 79 at 284 Green Street in Brimsdown, Enfield, North London, England, involving two sisters, aged 11 and 13. This incident became known as the Enfield poltergeist. However, 20 years before that incident, there was a very similar poltergeist haunting in another part of London in Battersea. In 1956, a family by the name of Hitchings lived in a terraced Victorian house at 63 Wycliffe Road, Battersea in South London. The family was Walter Hitchings, an underground train driver, Kitty the mother, Shirley the teenage daughter, Ethel the grandmother, and an adopted son called John. One day, strange things started to happen when an ornate key appeared on the pillow of 15-year-old Shirley's pillow. She then showed the key to other members of her family, but none of them had ever seen it before. They tried the key in various locks of the house, but it did not fit any of the doors. One night in January 1956, knocking began, followed by loud banging, thumps, and then incessant pounding that rebounded around the house. It was so loud that neighbours started to complain about the noise. Then scratching appeared to come from inside the furniture, and the lights started to flash on and off. Shirley clung to her father, begging him to make it stop, but for the terrified Hitchings family, this was only the beginning, and during the cacophony, the key suddenly vanished. The noises would continue night after night, and believing it was a malevolent spirit, the family nicknamed it Donald, named after the bad-tempered Donald Duck. In March, the poltergeist started to draw messages on the bedroom walls and started to make demands, such as wanting Shirley to wear her hair in a certain way. It then threatened them, saying it would set fires in the house. Her father locked all the matches and knives in the air raid shelter in the cellar, but unfortunately, fires started all over the house. One night her father got burned putting out a fire. Underneath the burn were gouge marks, like he'd been clawed. The spirit then tried to push her grandmother down the stairs. Night after night the whole house would shake, which lasted for 3 weeks, and it felt like they were in an air raid. The family had now become traumatised and sleep deprived. The police were called in, followed by surveyors, who looked for possible causes of the noises, but they could not find anything and left with no explanation. 3 weeks later, things took a turn for the worse when objects started to move, and one of Shirley's gloves lifted off of the floor, striking her father in the face. Pots and pans started flying out of the kitchen when nobody was there, and on another occasion, the pots floated towards them and then suddenly speed up, causing them to duck. All the pots would just hover in the air before striking the wall. The family could only watch in total amazement and horror as a pair of slippers walked around the room, and on other occasions the piano would start playing by itself. One night Shirley was suddenly awoken when her sheets were being dragged from the bed. Her family were woken up by her screaming and rushed into her bedroom and found they had become embroiled in a vicious tug-of-war with invisible hands trying to pull the sheets in the opposite direction. If that was not terrifying enough, then they saw their daughter go stiff, her back arch, and slowly levitated off of the bed. The whole time Shirley was conscious, but had no control over the malevolent force. After this episode, Shirley believed she was going mad and was possessed by the devil. She kept crying and was completely traumatized. With so much drama, it was inevitable that the story would reach the national press, and the family became besieged by the media, where the whole saga caught the public's imagination, becoming a national news story that was even discussed in Parliament. The family were approached by a man called Harold Chibbett, who had the nickname Chib. Chib was a ghost hunter who informed the family that they were dealing with a poltergeist and claimed it was responsible for the throwing of objects and loud noises. Chib also claimed that wherever there were poltergeists, there was usually a teenage girl at the centre of the activity. Shirley and her family had never heard of a poltergeist before. In order to rid themselves of this spiteful force, the family brought in a medium by the name of Harry Hanks, hoping that Hanks could exorcise the poltergeist. But Chib suggested they should first try and communicate with the spirit. Chib then laid out some letter cards on the table, where he would point to the letters and the spirit would tap when the right letters were reached to spell out words. They made early progress when the spirit slowly began to tap out messages. He claimed to be French and said that he was scared, but Shirley showed little sympathy after what he had put them through and told him to go. Although this session proved successful in communicating with the spirit, strange happenings continued when messages appeared on the walls, such as Vive France. Chib then left some paper and a pen in the family's front room and then locked up the room and took the key home. The following day, Chib unlocked the door and found that many notes had been written in a strange mixture of French and English, but many were illegible. Some of the notes were addressed to Monsieur Chibet. The spirit claimed to be the lost Dauphin, Louis Charles, heir to the throne of France. The fate of the 10-year-old son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution had been subject to 200 years of speculation. The letters from the spirit contained many facts few would have known, such as the name of Louis Charles' bodyguards, which were later verified in Parisian archives by Chib. In October, objects started to float around and the room was filled with whispering. Then suddenly they heard the voice of an Irish woman, which Shirley's grandmother claimed was her mother's voice. She spoke back to the voice and then went to her room. A few days later, she suffered a stroke and died shortly afterwards. Had the poltergeist claimed its first victim? Hoping to rid themselves of the spirit, in 1964 their family moved to Latchmere Road, which was a 50-minute walk away, but the activity continued in the new house. Shirley claimed that the disturbances ruined her teenage years, and it was not until she was 21 that her life became close to anything normal. On one occasion, a boyfriend came to the house and tried to goad the poltergeist by saying, "Come on, Donald, do your worst." The young man fled after a bowl was tipped onto his head. On another occasion, she went out in a car with her future husband, and when she came home, found her mother with written messages saying what they'd been up to together. In 1968, Shirley lived in West Sussex and was married with a child, and the spirit would leave messages on the telephone notepad telling her what her parents were doing in London. Finally, one note said that he was leaving, and they never heard from him again. But that was not the end of the story. When in the 1980s, a medium approached Shirley at a craft fair and told Shirley she was being followed by a boy wearing blue satin clothes with red hair. One night at a psychic evening with her daughter, Shirley was giving a message from a boy who said he was sorry for all he'd done. The most frightening aspect of the story is that Shirley was just an ordinary person, and if it can happen to someone like her, it can happen to anyone. Today Shirley is almost 80 and a great-grandmother and lives in the south of England. She says the haunting is as real today as it was all those years ago. She is emphatic that it was all true, and it really did happen. The following strange case took place in 2016, where an Australian family went on a road trip that led to bizarre circumstances, leaving the police and medical authorities totally baffled as to what brought about this strange family behaviour and eventual breakdown. This story is about a family of 5 who on the spur of the moment undertook a road trip where they all became divided, only to turn up one by one after a week-long nightmare of more than 1,600 kilometres, ending with a police investigation and 2 of them in psychiatric care. The Trump family appeared by all accounts to be a hard-working Australian family that ran a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in the small town of Sylvan, situated in the picturesque Dandenong Ranges 40 kilometres east of Melbourne, Victoria. The family were Mark, 51, his wife Jacoba, 53, and their 3 adult children, Rihanna, 29, Mitchell, 25, and Ella, 22. One day, on the 29th of August 2016, the family appeared to flee their home in a panic, leaving behind their credit cards, mobile phones, passports, and then drove north. Without warning, they dropped everything and fled. However, the only family member to take his phone was Mitchell, but when they reached the town of Warburton, only 30 kilometres from their home in Sylvan, they found out that he was carrying his mobile phone and made him throw it out of the car window, convinced it was being used to track them. It appears that the cards, phones, passports were deliberately left behind, fearing that if they were to use them, they could be located any time or anywhere. They had obviously only taken cash to evade whatever they believed was following them by staying off the grid. The family drove in their daughter's Ella's silver Peugeot SUV and drove both day and night till they felt they had reached a safe distance. They arrived at a town west of Sydney called Bathurst in New South Wales. They had driven non-stop for 800 kilometres. It was in Bathurst on the 30th of August that their son Mitchell had obviously had enough and decided to leave, where he appeared to be the only one in the family not swept up in the belief that they were in danger. He later said that he had gone along to ensure they would all be safe, but that his parents became increasingly delusional and hard to tolerate. Later that morning, the remaining family members drove east from Bathurst to the Jenolan Caves, a popular tourist destination. The family tensions or paranoia had obviously worsened when the daughters Rihanna and Ella also decided to split from their parents. But they did not just walk away or catch public transport, they stole a car. Continuing with their bizarre actions, the sisters then drove south to the New South Wales town of Goulburn, where they reported to police that their parents were missing. After leaving the police station in Goulburn, the sisters decided to go their separate ways at a service station, where Ella wanted to go home and feed her horses, and then drove back to Victoria. Ella was the first family member to arrive back at the family farm on Tuesday night and found police there. Her brother Mitchell would arrive home the following morning, having taken a series of trains. However, in yet another strange twist, because Ella had taken the car, Rihanna had secretly climbed into the back of a utility vehicle in Goulburn, and about an hour out of town was discovered there by the male driver. He immediately pulled over and found her to be in a state of total shock and almost catatonic. She told the driver that she did not know her name or where she was, although this could have been a defensive tactic by making out she was confused because he had caught her in the back of his utility. The driver was obviously convinced that she was suffering from mental illness and drove her to Goulburn Hospital, where she was placed in psychiatric care. By this time, the story had made its way into the media, where the bizarre series of events left Australians scratching their heads. They were asking how a supposedly normal family on holiday had become separated and confused in virtual suburbia. This sort of thing only happened in remote regions such as the vast Australian outback. At all times, they were close to large towns. But the family drama escalated even more when the parents, Mark and Jacoba, left the Jenolan Caves in New South Wales and drove back south towards Melbourne. A day later, 600 kilometres south in the Victorian town of Wangaratta, they too became separated. where in yet another unusual twist, Jacoba then headed back north. Authorities have no idea what her mode of transport was or how she got there, but the next day, on Thursday the 1st of September, she was found 350 kilometres away, wandering around a town called Yass, which is only 53 kilometres from Australia's capital city, Canberra. She was found wandering around in an agitated state and taken to a local hospital. They later moved her to Goulburn to be with her daughter Rihanna. Mother and daughter were now both being treated for mental health issues. Her husband Mark had decided to remain in Wangaratta, where his mental health appeared to deteriorate like his wife. In another strange act, he was later seen dangerously tailgating a young couple. Meanwhile, police had also begun investigating a number of break-ins in the town, including at a motel, though it's unclear if they were related. But by the way this family were going from disaster to disaster, the break-ins would have been an extension of their weird behaviour over the previous 2 days. The break-ins would have come as no surprise. On Saturday evening, 3rd of September, 6 days after the whole extraordinary episode began, Mark Tromp was found beside a road near Wangaratta Airport. He was questioned by police and then released into the care of his brother, who ironically was a police officer. However, at this stage, you would think he'd be relieved by the whole ordeal. Yet as he was being driven away by his brother, he abused photographers by showing them his middle finger. He later addressed the media, feeling remorseful, and apologised for any hurt or concern caused by the strange series of events. He also thanked the community resources that assisted in his family's aid. While Mitchell and Ella appeared reasonably unaffected mentally, the same could not be said for the rest of the family. It was later revealed that the parents, Mark and Jacoba, had been suffering increasing signs of stress and paranoia. According to media sources, at least one of them had become convinced someone was out to get them and take their money. While Rihanna was not charged for motorcar theft due to diminished responsibility, Ella was charged with car theft. Back at home in Sylvan, Mitchell and Ella appeared before the media. They stated that they were totally baffled by their parents' paranormal behaviour. He said, "I've never seen anyone like this or anyone conduct themselves in this way. He's not dangerous, he's my mate, my father, I love him." In summing up the whole unbelievable saga, police do not believe there was any real threat to the family. Sergeant Mark Knight claims to have known the family and said that there was no history or evidence of drugs. The family had no debts and did not belong to any weird religious cult. Mitchell and Ella Tromp admitted it was hard to explain, but maybe it was a build-up of normal everyday stress and pressure that reached a sudden climax. Police are also contemplating whether the family suffered from collective delusions in an episode of Folie à Deux. The French term meaning madness of two covers a rare psychological condition occurring almost exclusively in close-knit families. Doctors were unable to tell which of them had become psychotic first. It was clear they had fallen into a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusion. Police said no further charges are expected to be laid, and that the issue is now simply a family affair. One investigating police officer from the Sylvan district described it as the most bizarre case I've seen in 30 years of policing. The Smells were a fairly typical family living in West Pittston, Pennsylvania in the 1980s. The family of 6 included parents Janet and Jack Smell and their 4 daughters, Dawn, Heather, and twins Shannon and Karen. The Smells were a well-respected Catholic family. Jack and Janet both grew up locally, meeting in 1967 and marrying a year later. Jack served in the Navy and went on to become a neuropsychiatric technician. The family's 13-year saga began with a completely natural occurrence. When Hurricane Agnes flooded the house in 1972, the young Smells, with their first 2 daughters, moved in with Jack's parents on 330 Chase Street. Their duplex home would soon plunge them into a sinister and terrifying new reality. The house was originally built in 1896 and was located on a sedate street in a quiet middle-class neighbourhood. Jack's parents had purchased the place in 1973. They lived in the right half, while their son's family occupied the left side of the house. The Smells invested a lot of effort into their half of the property, and spent what money they could repairing and redecorating, with the intention of turning their new house into a comfortable home. The eerie activity began innocently enough in January 1974. Tools went missing, then reappeared. A mysterious discoloration spread on one of the new carpets, and old wall stains oozed through fresh coats of paint. Then the phenomena became more dramatic. A television set incinerated. Resoldered pipes continued to leak, and the new sink and bathtub suddenly had unexplained scratches. Kitchen appliances burst into flames, even when unplugged, and horrible odours swamped the house, only to disperse in a flash. In 1975, the older daughter, Dawn, began telling her parents she was seeing people hovering in her bedroom. Regardless, the Small family soldiered on. Jack achieved a job promotion and took on coaching his daughter's softball team. Janet gave birth to twin girls and helped organise an anti-drink driving group at the nearby high school. The older girls were excelling in their studies, and the in-laws were happy until in 1977, the unnerving phenomena inside the home started to intensify. Until then, the intermittent occurrences were easily dismissed, but the inexplicable phenomena started to include disembodied footsteps, unplugged radio suddenly blaring music, random cold spots, and drawers opening and slamming as if in anger, as well as a permeating stench of rot around the home. Jack reported feeling an unseen hand caress him and a persistent sense of being watched. By 1985, the activity had escalated to an all-time high. The addition of the twins Shannon and Karen to the household only seemed to increase the activity. Janet and Jack's mother Mary claimed to have heard voices that sounded like one of the family members. Janet was convinced she heard her mother-in-law calling her name, while Mary reported hearing Janet and Jack in a non-existent, full-blown argument laden with heavy swearing. Terrifying black masses formed and floated around the home. After that night, the occurrences became more ominous and disturbingly violent in the small house. A light fixture dropped from the ceiling, cutting one of the children on impact. Scratches started appearing on family members. The walls would rattle, the parents' mattress would be shaken, and the family dog was repeatedly thrown against the wall. One night while sleeping, Shannon was dragged out of bed and tossed down the stairs. Janet also reported being picked up by an invisible presence, struggling some 6 feet in the air and then hurled across the room. Jack claimed a succubus invaded the living room and violated him during a televised baseball game. Jack's parents on the other side of the party wall often heard insults, screams, and other loud noises coming from the small side of the duplex, but nothing ever manifested in their own home. Even neighbours claimed to hear shrieking from the house while the family was out. In January 1986, after years of the strange annoyances and then downright terror, the Smells contacted the controversial ghost-busting couple Rain and Ed Warren. Travelling from Connecticut to Pennsylvania, the pair brought with them Rosemary Frew, a nurse and psychic. In their initial assessment, the Warrens concluded that there were 4 different entities within the home. 3 were reasonably harmless and probably responsible for the more minor haunting phenomena. They were an elderly woman, a young but aggressive girl, and a man who had suffered and passed away in the house. However, the 4th spirit was both very powerful and angry, and was using the other 3 spirits to destroy the Small family. Ed Warren was quoted by the Times leader as saying, "The Smells are definitely a family coming under a visual attack. Whether a ghost, devil, demon, the presence is in that home." The Warrens theorised that the demon may have been dormant for decades, then was activated, drawing from the emotional energy of the growing girls. The Warrens' investigation lasted 6 months. To counter the most powerful entity, the so-called demon, they conducted prayer sessions and played religious music, but the force reportedly shook mirrors and furniture, and even wrote a message on a mirror telling them to get out. Ed Warren decided to enlist a Vatican-mandated exorcist named Father McKenna. However, his attempted exorcism backfired and seemed to make the demon even more virulent. At this stage, several members of the family reported being physically violated or otherwise caused illness by the entities. According to one commentator, both Janet and her older daughter Dawn said they had been intimately assaulted by the shadows they witnessed. One of the twins, Karen, has suddenly fallen ill and nearly succumbed to a mystery infection. Allegedly, both Janet and her mother-in-law had marks from beatings and bites all over their bodies. Soon into the investigation, the Small family found themselves the subject of a media circus. Strangers camped out in front of their house while cameras flashed and reporters crowded their lawn. A fleet of onlookers, cars cruised past hoping to spot a glimpse of something supernatural. Officials from the Roman Catholic Church in Scranton were at a loss as to what might be causing the phenomena. A bevy of priests visited the Smells to bless their home and reportedly encountered no harmful activity while in the house. In 1986, a local priest even moved into the property hoping to witness firsthand the demonic stirrings. But peace reigned, and after 2 nights without a problem, he left. Father McKenna conducted another exorcism some months later, which again failed. A third attempt at exorcism involving several priests and a group of local parishioners from a local church, this time not sanctioned by the Vatican, appeared to work. No phenomena were experienced for several months. However, activity started creeping in again, at which stage the exhausted family finally decided to leave the property. In 1987, the Smells, equally demoralised by the incessant media scrutiny, packed up and moved house. Bizarrely, the supernatural phenomena were reported to have followed them to their new abode, until a church-approved exorcism in 1989 cleansed the house of all activity. Since then, paranormal experts, priests, television producers and journalists have all closely examined the Smells story. Rumours had already begun to circulate about the family's supernatural claims, as they had recently fallen on hard times. Rumours of the ghostly phenomena being fake were further bolstered when Ed Warren contacted paranormal journalist Robert Curran and invited collaboration on a book about the Smells and their haunting. The subsequent owners of the Chase Street duplex, who moved into the house in 1988, have never reported any supernatural activity there and say that nothing unusual has ever occurred in their home. Likewise, the Smells never reported any lingering activity in their new home. Curran's book, called The Haunted, was published in 1988, and a telemovie by the same name came out in 1991. Whether a convinced spiritualist or skeptic, no one can deny the strangeness of the Smells tale.